I had to stop at a traffic light, and suddenly I felt my mother's soul pass through my heart. I can't describe it any other way. And, as it turned out later, that was the exact moment of her death. Yes, there is life after death, absolutely, 100% certain. And as for the church, I have to say, people seem to know absolutely nothing.
Do you get the impression that the church wants to know anything?
No.
Mr. Jakoby, you're an author and one of the best-known researchers into the dying in the German-speaking world. I'm sure you're writing another book at the moment, and if I've counted correctly, this should be your 20th.
The 25th.
You deal with near-death experiences, after-death or post-death contacts, and other phenomena. And to start with, I'd simply like to ask, after so many books, after so many years of research into death, what is your personal conclusion? Are you now completely convinced that consciousness continues after death?
I can certainly say that I am. I have spoken to thousands of people over the last 25 years. In fact, I've been working on this subject for 40 years. Back when Raymond Moody's first book was published in the 1970s, I was 17 or 18 years old. The subject has always fascinated me. But I write my books not least to point out to people that there is much more between heaven and earth than they can imagine. And it is precisely near-death experiences that show us that consciousness exists independently of the body. Within the brief period of 5 to 10 minutes when resuscitation is still possible, people experience a great deal. We have so many accounts from people who have had near-death experiences precisely because resuscitation techniques have been perfected over the last few decades, meaning that more and more people can be brought back from the brink of death. Today, there are certainly 80 million people worldwide who have had near-death experiences. It is probably even more than that. There are, of course, unreported cases. Many people do not talk about such experiences at all. But to return to your question, yes, there is life after death, absolutely, 100% certain. I feel it myself, too. I am in touch with the spiritual world. For 20 years, I have been able to sense my Gregory, who accompanies me and offers me insights into the spiritual world. And I can also sense my mother, who died 35 years ago. She is still close to me today, and we communicate with one another. This phenomenon of so-called near-death experiences is far more widespread than most people realize. In my experience, whenever I speak about this in seminars, perhaps 1 or 2 people initially pluck up the courage to share their own experiences. But as the day goes on, more and more people come forward, revealing just how many people have had such experiences.
You mentioned your companion briefly just now, for 20 years. Could you tell us how it came about that you feel and experience this companionship?
It was in 2007. I had a strange dream. There was a young man lying on a stretcher, covered with a shroud. And then he suddenly pulled it away and grinned at me. And then I thought, now you've gone completely mad. I didn't know the man. About a month later, I had another dream like that. In it, this man appeared, somehow wrapped in a sort of baby skin. And over the course of the year, I suddenly sensed a presence, and that this presence wanted to tell me something. I resisted it for a long time because I couldn't cope with it. I felt like a puppet, and I absolutely didn't want that. Towards the end of the year, however, I suddenly felt quite clearly a second stream of consciousness within me. And then the messages from the spiritual world began. The first sentence was, "You only need me. If you can accept that, you will feel better." All right, I thought, and opened myself up to the presence. And ever since then, it has always been there.
Weren't you feeling well at the time?
Well, everyone has difficulties in life now and then. Relationship problems and things like that.
So it was a specific form of personal support, right?
Yes, yes,
To this day?
yes.
And what about your mother?
My mother said goodbye to me at the moment of her death. I'll never forget that. I'd been keeping vigil with her all night, and then drove home in the morning. My brother, who'd been taking turns with me to stay with her, then rang me at 11:15 and asked me to come to the hospital straight away. Whilst driving, I had to stop at a traffic light, and suddenly I felt my mother's soul pass through my heart. I can't describe it any other way. And as it later turned out, that was the exact moment of her death. That was the most profound experience I had at the time. It also led me to turn my attention to research into dying. Because it's different when you haven't just read about these things, but have experienced them yourself.
So Raymond Moody gave you the impetus, and then it was this experience that set you on the path to research into the afterlife.
Exactly. And that experience still has an effect today. But not in the sense that I constantly feel a presence. I don't feel Gregory all the time either. I have to focus my attention on it. When I'm in a conversation, as I am now, I can't concentrate on my mother or Gregory. I have noticed that many people have had paranormal experiences during their lifetime, but have been unable to make sense of them. Often they simply lack a frame of reference to help them deal with such experiences. That is why I now see it as my role to encourage this a little, to take people by the hand, so to speak, so that they can develop confidence in their own experiences. It is, after all, very important, whether you're in contact with the spiritual world, have near-death experiences, or sense the presence of a deceased person, that you develop trust. This is often lacking. People find themselves thinking, am I just imagining all this?
Because there is a materialistic worldview in the background against which everything is measured.
Exactly, but you can't measure experiences like that. Ultimately, they manifest themselves as a feeling. What I find fascinating about post-death contacts is that those experiencing them know exactly who is suddenly in the room with them. They can distinguish precisely between their deceased mother or brother or, for example, a friend. That's fascinating. Evidently, the soul in the spiritual world has a specific aura through which one can identify it immediately. You know exactly who it is.
Keyword soul, identification of the soul. People who have had near-death experiences very often report seeing light and feeling love. There is also, as death research suggests, the experience of oneness, that sense of connectedness with everything, which some also describe as dissolving into the light. Some even say that the I, as they know it in the earthly world, no longer exists. Others say it is an expansion of the I. But there are also other aspects of near-death experiences, such as encounters with the deceased or mediumistic contacts, which suggest that there is indeed a soul body, the soul as a whole.
What I find most fascinating about near-death experiences is that in the millions of reports available today, there is always mention of experiences of God. That people, once immersed in this unconditional love, suddenly possess all knowledge. I am currently working on a book on this subject. I find it most important because it shows us that this higher power exists. For me, there is no question that one can have mediumistic contacts. But I find the realization that we are all part of a higher context of meaning to be central. This is also demonstrated by experiences of oneness. They show our connectedness with the whole world and with all of existence.
I was simply focusing on the concept of the soul. On the surface, this does seem like a contradiction. On the one hand, the feeling of dissolving, this experience of oneness, and on the other, a concrete soul body. My question is this: how do you view this? How do these two fit together? From your perspective, does the soul as such continue to exist as a body, such that it is also identifiable? And if so, what significance do experiences of oneness then have? How do you assess that?
I think that we all have a specific identity, independent of one another, which is eternal. What I refer to as the soul is also consciousness. People always say that consciousness survives death. Near-death experiences point to this very clearly. I simply think that one can also identify this concept of consciousness with the soul. So that means, after death, we simply immerse ourselves in this unconditional love that is so often spoken of. But we are also confronted with ourselves in the process. And that shows, of course, that we still have a sense of self in a certain way. Anyone who experiences a review of their life during a near-death experience does not merely experience it from their own perspective, but is also confronted with the consequences of their thoughts, deeds, and words, and experiences these at the same time. This is how God's love works. There is also no one there to judge, but one must face up to one's own responsibility. I also think that we humans have many lives, because one cannot achieve this enlightenment or this union with God in a single lifetime. As souls, we have probably always existed. We come from a non-physical origin and return to that origin. In this context, many people who believe in reincarnation ask, so is my father still there in the afterlife once I have died, or has he already reincarnated? And I simply think that part of one's identity remains in the afterlife. But the soul is, of course, much more complex. It may belong to a soul group. And what incarnates is that which still needs to be redeemed.
So a part of the soul from your point of view?
Yes, they are aspects of the soul.
Now that we have this broad overview, as you have just outlined it, consciousness that perhaps unfolds and develops across several earthly lives in certain respects, however that may be, what significance does a near-death experience have? Many people believe, based on this experience of light and oneness, that this is the final state that awaits them after death. And then there is also a kind of longing for the light that many who have had near-death experiences carry with them throughout their lives, in the hope of perhaps being able to experience it again permanently. In your view, is this experience of light, this experience of oneness, really the permanent state that awaits us after death? Or is it more of a transitional experience? Just as one can have an experience of love in life, which is an important impetus for certain people, but then the experience of light could not be equated with life in the afterlife itself. How do you see it?
I believe that we are eternal spiritual beings and that spiritual development continues on and on. Those who have had near-death experiences usually perceive the light as a catalyst for changing their lives. That is what I find so fascinating. People who have had a profound near-death experience, who have experienced this light and, above all, this love, this indescribable, unconditional love, undergo a fundamental transformation. They may no longer judge others. They have more compassion for others. In my view, that is the real message of a near-death experience and a review of one's life. The question is always, have I given love, or have I held love back? And when you look at today's world with its ceaseless wars and crises everywhere, the madness we see daily in the news, how radically many people now treat one another, then, in my view, it is clear that the majority of humanity is not in love. They have no idea what that is.
Is that also why near-death experiences are important?
Yes, near-death experiences simply confront us with the fact that this afterlife, let's call it that for now, exists. That we live on, that we do indeed meet the deceased there again, that we have experiences with beings of light or spirit guides. There is something that surrounds us. Always. We can recognize it as soon as we find the courage to trust and don't react so stubbornly. It's exactly the same with post-death contact. Most people don't dare to talk about it at all, because they find that those around them simply dismiss such experiences. Because we live in a completely materialistic society where, in my view, the concept of love no longer plays a significant role. Most people don't even know what it is.
Perhaps we could go into more detail about after-death contacts. It is, after all, a fascinating subject. I have another question about near-death experiences. These long-lasting after-effects are actually one of the strongest indications that these are genuine experiences, not just brief delusions or something triggered by medication or whatever. Based on your research, do you have any figures that could describe the scale of these after-effects? For example, I once heard, though I couldn't verify it, that the divorce rate is said to be over 50% among people who have had near-death experiences. Do you have any figures to hand that might quantify these after-effects?
Divorce is an important aspect that I've also heard about frequently. But I cannot quote any figures on this. The 50% figure may well be correct, because people who have had near-death experiences suddenly have completely different goals in life. Their social behavior also changes, and many marriages cannot withstand that. If, for example, a man has had a near-death experience and suddenly wants to become a social worker, even though he previously held a high-level office job, then that is naturally something that relatives may not be able to cope with. I have heard of such examples many times.
It can also lead to existential crisis.
Yes. Relatives often simply cannot cope when a person changes completely.
They want the person they used to know back.
Yes, they want the person they used to know. And that's why the divorce rate is so high.
Let's now talk in a little more detail about the subject of after-death contact. You have already mentioned it. Such contact occurs very frequently. If I'm not mistaken, studies have shown that over 50% of a deceased person's close relatives spontaneously experience some kind of presence. How did you come across this subject? Probably through your own experience with your mother, which also points in the direction of after-death contact.
Yes, it is not uncommon for the dying or those who have just passed away to say goodbye. That is, in itself, a kind of post-death contact. It is interesting, for example, to hear reports where someone looks at the clock at the moment of death and suddenly senses their deceased mother or father, or whoever it may be, or you clearly sense the person who has just passed away, and at that very moment you receive a phone call, say at 4:30 in the morning. I would interpret these experiences as meaning that the dying person, or the person who has just passed away, is thinking of a specific person in order to say goodbye. And then they are immediately with them. This is also described in near-death experiences. Everything happens all at once. Space and time seem to be suspended. This means we can stay in touch with the deceased. And post-death contacts show that the deceased often respond to the thoughts and distress of their loved ones. They want to tell them, "I'm fine. Don't worry. Live your life. We'll meet again." That is actually the core message in all these post-death contacts. And that is precisely what is so difficult for many to understand. How can it be that my deceased father is suddenly with me? Often this experience is also linked to a profound sense of love, so that one feels immersed in bliss. And that is something one cannot explain. I recently had a conversation with a woman who told me about something like this. Unbelievable. But ultimately, it's simply important to know we are part of a greater whole.
Key phrase, "we'll meet again." That's also the title of one of your books. Among other things, this book deals with deathbed visions and contact with the deceased. Do you regard deathbed visions as a valid way of coming to believe in life after death?
Most dying people experience an expanded state of consciousness towards the end of the dying process. This means they are drawing closer to the spiritual world. It is important to note that near-death experiences also involve this expanded state of consciousness. As a result, the dying experience visions of deceased relatives who have come to collect them, to support them, and so on. This can often be observed from the outside as well. The phenomenon is widespread. The dying point upwards with their hands, or they look into the corner of the room, or at the ceiling, or wherever they perceive something. And when you are there as a companion, you get the impression that yes, they really are seeing something that you cannot see. In recent years, there has also been extensive scientific research into these common phenomena. For example, nursing staff have been asked about their observations. In hospice work, too, there are repeated reports of deathbed visions. Hospice workers, for instance, find that the dying speak of their deceased relatives, whose presence they perceive. These frequent visions are further evidence that there is obviously another world.
A current topic in end-of-life research is shared death experiences. That is, shared experiences of death and also shared near-death experiences, which are rare. Have you looked into this as well? Are you aware of any such cases? Generally speaking, these are not reported on very often.
I myself have heard such accounts perhaps 2 or 3 times in recent years. One can assume that such things do happen. But ultimately, it simply means that it is possible to be drawn into a person's dying process. That is, when the soul is slowly separating from the body. Numerous reports have emerged from around the world of people who have experienced being drawn into this process of the soul's separation from the body. They have experienced it practically as a near-death experience and accompanied the dying person on their journey to the other world up to a certain point. Sometimes they have even witnessed the other person's life review.
And that is, of course, a special situation. because a personal experience is effectively confirmed from another perspective.
Yes, and many descriptions have now been documented of how the soul left the body. A kind of mist was seen, a light. The room lit up. They are fascinating accounts. I also believe that such experiences have always existed. It's just that in our society, we've never reached the point where we could talk about them openly. If, for example, the mainstream media, such as television, were to invite people who have experienced such phenomena and, above all, near-death experiences, and if this were presented on a larger scale, many millions might identify with it. But such a discussion about dying and death does not take place. Instead, the reports are viewed critically, along the lines of, we can't possibly know anything about it. Yet, it would be really important to be open to these widespread phenomena, because we are currently experiencing a culture of fear that seems to know no bounds. And I think experiences like these could actually help to alleviate fears, particularly the fear of death. If I have to die tomorrow, then so be it. I am, after all, part of something greater. If I know that, if I know it for certain, and also know that my deceased relatives or friends will be with me then, I really have nothing to fear.
Near-death experiences change people profoundly. On the other hand, and this is also my experience, if you engage intensively with the subject, they can also change your own worldview. What was your journey like in that respect? Can you consciously reflect on what decades of research into death have done for you? How has your worldview changed? Were you already, right from the start, ever since your mother's experience, fully convinced of life after death?
No, it was quite a journey of self-discovery that I embarked upon. At the start, for instance, I was very skeptical about the idea of reincarnation. I couldn't quite picture it. But one grows, after all. When you're an author and develop topics further, year by year, you develop yourself along with them. A worldview doesn't develop overnight. I mean, just reading a book doesn't really help me. I have to internalize it as well. And I think that over the years, my journey has simply led to an expansion of consciousness. Today, it's completely normal for me.
As an author, you naturally work with language. When you look back over your journey, do you feel that you now have an overall picture that can be expressed in language more clearly than before? Or would you tend to say that for you, the mystery has actually grown along the way, so that words have lost their meaning, whilst it has become a certainty to you that there is something beyond what can be described?
I don't see it as an either-or situation. I simply try to convey things linguistically in such a way that the people who read my books can understand them too. And that, I believe, is my greatest strength. I know that people who've had near-death experiences find it very difficult to put their experiences into words. But I still assume that they experience something that is, for them, a clear and distinct certainty.
Which can be expressed in words.
Yes, there are metaphors. Near-death experiences are a universal phenomenon. They are experienced in a similar way all over the world. The transitions in the dying process are universal phenomena. And I do believe that it is possible to find a language to convey these experiences.
Without the risk that certain terms used might be interpreted differently from how you yourself intended them. or that the language might not do justice to the actual experience?
I've tried to do that from the very beginning. When I look at my old books today, say the one whose title translates as "You Too Will Live Forever," from the year 2000, I'm sometimes surprised myself at how clearly things are already formulated there. But as an author, I've probably continued to develop my language over the decades. I think that's also what sets my seminar paper apart, that I've managed to find a relatively clear way of expressing myself. Of course, there are also people who feel that the negative aspects aren't emphasized enough in the overall picture I paint. Fear has come into play here too. But the negative does not play such a major role in near-death experiences. Of course, one shouldn't believe that one will simply wake up to love and everything will be fine. That's not how it is, as the reports on life reviews show us. We must assume that we bear personal responsibility for our lives, and that applies to every single one of us. If I have raped children, murdered people, or done similar things, I must face up to that. But there is no one there to judge you. Everyone judges themselves and, through such actions, hinders their own further development.
Near-death experiences touch on areas and themes: life after death, the afterlife, threshold experiences that are traditionally the preserve of religion. The various faiths have provided information on what life after death is like or might be like. Do you believe that religious expectations, heaven, hell, encounters with beings of light, are generally confirmed by near-death experiences? Or do near-death experiences tend to hold surprises?
I wouldn't distinguish between heaven and hell at all anymore. There isn't a single hell that we ultimately end up in. Rather, it should be understood that I must answer to myself. That is what those who have had near-death experiences report. And as for the churches, I have to say, they obviously know nothing at all. That is my experience. This old image, heaven, hell, and punishment, is, for me, also incompatible with the image of God as love. This is one of the most important things that people who've had near-death experiences tell us. Many churches portray God differently, but I would say there is, after all, only one God. There is a single source from which we all come, regardless of culture or religion. This applies just as much to an Indian, even if he may have different beliefs and worship many gods, which are, however, always merely aspects of the one deity. But the idea that if you do this or that, you'll go to hell, that's not how it is. The Church knows nothing.
Do you get the impression that the Church wants to know anything?
No, I don't.
In your experience, how do they deal with the subject of near-death experiences there?
I can only speak from my own experience, but wherever I go, I'm regularly attacked in the local press by bishops or Protestant ministers. But I don't care about that at all anymore.
Attacked why? As a false teacher?
Yes, how can you be sure of what you're saying? But when I consider that I've spent 40 years dealing almost exclusively with this subject, spoken to thousands upon thousands of people, and have my own experiences, and that I also have a connection to God, if you want to call it spiritual guidance, how can I still take these attacks seriously? It's always about taking an opposing stance. We're right, or the Catholic Church is the only true one. That's not actually true.
Did you have a religious upbringing as a child?
Yes, Catholic, and I'm glad about that. Because even then I knew that God exists. But today that connection isn't as close anymore. I still like going to churches, but only when they're empty.
On your website, you present yourself as a researcher into death. Drawing on your decades of experience, you offer counseling, including for those who have had near-death experiences. Please tell us a little about your specific work, what you do, and also what research means to you. Do you also conduct studies in a strict sense, or is it more a matter of piecing together individual experiences you have heard about to form an overall picture? What does research mean to you?
For me, research means, on the one hand, taking as a basis what people tell me in conversations, consultations, and so on. In other words, these case studies, which, after all, often corroborate one another. But I'm also constantly looking at new studies at the moment. I have thousands of books at home that I've collected over the last 40 years. And I cross-reference the literature with the testimonials. I no longer need to conduct my own studies. I can help people through conversation by showing them that I understand them. When I speak to someone, I know immediately what their problem is and where the real issue lies. My strength lies in reacting intuitively.
Do you feel that nowadays, even though the term near-death experience is well known and people talk about it more openly, there are still a great many people who have had such an experience but simply cannot cope with it and who then seek help?
Yes, and I get the impression that the number is growing. Looking back 10 years, the subject was more prominent in the public eye than it is now. After talks, I often find that 2 or 3 people come up to me and say, "Yes, now I finally understand what I experienced 20 years ago." The number of people who have never grappled with this issue is growing. Looking back, I get the impression that after COVID, during which time, practically speaking, you couldn't do anything in public for 3 years, it has somehow lost its significance. Before, 10 or 15 years ago, people simply seemed more open to me. Now everything is characterized by a sense of fear. And society is only just beginning to open up to these things again. That is my experience.
I get the impression that during the COVID era, these discussions have, above all, served to widen the gap between materialism and idealism. And that is why the whole subject of near-death experiences is now being pushed even further into the dubious realm of the esoteric. Do you see it that way too?
I see it exactly the same way.
And I have also the impression that the subject of near-death experiences is increasingly being co-opted by Christian fundamentalist movements, particularly in the English-speaking world. That experiences are being reported which, at first glance, one should actually recognize as fake. That, too, is a burden on the subject. What is your view on this?
I can only confirm that. I can't say any more on the matter. That's just how it is.
What developments do you foresee for the future? What hopes do you have?
When I think back, I believe it was 2011 when Ibn Alexander published his wonderful book, Proof of Heaven. Anita Morjani also provided some very powerful insights. In German-speaking countries, people were talking about Anke Everts. But who knows these people today? Bookshops used to have 2 or 3 shelves full of literature on the subject. Today, there's hardly any left. You won't find my books everywhere either. That doesn't bode well.
How do you assess the future development of our worldview? There is, after all, sometimes an expression of hope that near-death experiences actually challenge the materialistic worldview. Do you see any signs of new approaches emerging?
Anyone who studies near-death experiences in depth naturally still hopes for a paradigm shift. There are, after all, countless scientists who are and have been studying these phenomena. But there are also many who claim that there is no consciousness after death because it depends solely on the brain. So, after the death of a person and their brain, there can be nothing more. But near-death experiences clearly show us that it is precisely at the moment of clinical death, when, according to the materialist view, we should no longer have any consciousness, that this experience begins, the out-of-body experience. And that cannot be explained in materialist terms. A paradigm shift has been on the cards for years. I do believe that humanity needs to wake up. It must wake up from its lethargy, otherwise it will destroy itself. Near-death experiences can show us very clearly that we are more than just a little earthly I or ego wandering about here. I'm convinced of that.
I think that was a good closing remark. Thank you for the conversation.
That's fine.